Haha, you thought I was done making fairy tale videos, but it was me, procrastination. So a while back I made a video talking about a hypothetical situation, where fairy tale characters end up in the Yu-Gi-Oh world and have to play a children's card game instead of using their magic, and what decks certain characters would use in that scenario. I only covered some major characters in that video, like the Dragon Slayers, Team Natsu, and the main villains Acnologia and Zeref. And in this video I'm gonna go over some other characters that I didn't have time for in the last video. However, this time I won't be featuring any replays of the decks mentioned. One reason being that I'm gonna cover a lot more characters this time, so showing replays would just take way too much time. And the other one being, some of these decks are bad. Real bad. Maybe not all of them, heck maybe not even most of them, but those that are, yikes! However, I am going to show deck lists of every deck mentioned in this video, so if you wanna take them for a spin and get curb stomped by Invoked Eldritch or whatever people are playing nowadays, be my guest. First I'll cover some Fairy Tail members, because they are the focus of the show after all. Starting with the 3rd, 6th and 8th Master of Fairy Tail, Makarov Dreyer. The types of magic he was shown using most prominently are his signature magic Giant and a form of light attribute magic, so I think a good fit for him would be a Utopia deck. The deck focuses mostly on summoning multiple level 4 monsters, which are then overlaid into a rank 4 Utopia Xyz monster, and can then be ranked up by simply stacking another higher ranked monster on top of the lower ranked one, or by using a rank up magic spell. This mechanic kinda reminds me of Makarov's ability to grow to a giant size, and all the Utopia monsters are light attribute, so I think it fits him quite well. Next we have the 5th Master of Fairy Tail, Gildarts Clive. His signature magic is Crush, and like the name suggests, it can absolutely annihilate anything in its way. So I thought a good fit for him would be a deck that can overcome any board the opponent may set up on his first turn, and then finish the game in one shot, as is Gildarts' style. And the deck that can do that most consistently, as far as I know, is a Grand Maju deck. The list you see here utilizes cards that are good for going second, like Kaijus and Super Polymerization, and of course cards that can banish your own cards to make your Grand Maju big enough to one-shot your opponent. Next let's cover the Strauss siblings, starting with Mirajane. She uses a form of takeover magic called Satan's Soul, which allows her to transform into demons whose bodies she's taken over. So for her, I picked a Dark Lord deck. They are not exactly demons, they are dark fairy type monsters based on the fallen angels from Judeo-Christian mythology, and their boss monster is the guy that later becomes Satan, Lucifer Morningstar. The deck's strategy mostly revolves around sending the Dark Lord monsters, spells and traps to the graveyard, then special summoning the monsters from the graveyard, who can then copy the effects of Dark Lord spells and traps in the graveyard, while they are on the field. Moving on we have Elfman. He also uses a form of takeover magic called Beast Soul, which allows him to transform into various beast-man hybrids. And since he's a musclehead obsessed with manliness, I thought a battle-themed deck full with beast warrior type monsters would be a perfect fit for him, something like gladiator beasts. They are one of the first decks that utilize a mechanic known as contact fusion, meaning they don't need polymerization to special summon their fusion monsters. Instead, they just shuffle the main deck gladiator beast monsters from the field into the deck to summon the fusion monsters from the extra deck. And if the fusion monsters battle, at the end of the battle phase, they can return themselves to the extra deck to special summon the main deck monsters back on the field. And the last of the Strauss siblings is Lisanna, who, like her older siblings, also uses a takeover magic called Animal Soul. Her transformations are not an exact replica of the animal they are based on. Instead, they are more cutesy and cartoony. So a deck like Memphis I think would be perfect for her. They are all level 2 Earth Beast monsters based on cute animals, and their extra deck monsters are rank 2 Xyz monsters. But they can also utilize other level 2 Beast monsters, and there's a number of good level 2 Beast monsters. And additionally, with a card like Obedience Cult, they can make some pretty powerful boards. Up next we have Fairy Tail's thirstiest girl, Juvia. She uses magic that allows her to conjure and manipulate water, and she can even turn her own body into water. There are a lot of water themed and water attribute focused decks in Yu-Gi-Oh, so it was a pretty hard decision to pick one out for her, but ultimately I went for Marincess. It's a deck full with Aqua Maidens just like Juvia, although they are Cybers type. They are kind of a beatdown deck that likes to link climb into more powerful link monsters, which can then equip other link monsters from their graveyard with the help of their field spell, to gain more attack and some additional effects. Moving on from one fan favorite blue-haired girl to another, let's talk about Levy for a bit. Her magic of choice is Solid Script, which allows her to conjure physical words, which have the properties based on the word's definition. So fire burns and makes fire, and a hole makes a hole, and so on and so forth. That magic reflects her love for books and bookworm personality. So it'd be wrong to select anything other than spellbooks as her deck. And to be honest, I don't really know much about spellbooks and their playstyle and win condition, because I didn't really play Yu-Gi-Oh at the time they were tearing up the meta. So here's a list someone else made. I guess it's good, I don't know. Could be real bad, but I don't really wanna get out of my way to test it. So yeah. And the last fairy tale member I wanna talk about for this video is Cana. She uses card magic that employs cards similar to tarot cards, and her name even comes from the tarot's arcana. So those of you who have played Yu-Gi-Oh long enough probably know where I'm going with this. That's right, for her I picked the Arcana Force deck. This is one of, if not the worst deck in Yu-Gi-Oh! It forces another layer of luck to a game that is already very luck of the draw oriented, by giving every monster in the archetype a coin toss effect, with one effect being relatively good and the other extremely bad. Their field spell kinda helps with that, and you can use the spell card second coin toss to redo your coin toss if the result wasn't favorable. They do have a monster that can skip your opponent's next turn, but it requires too much setup and it's on a level 8 coin toss monster. So yeah, it's no wonder this archetype never made an impact on the game. Kinda like Cana did in the fairy tale anime. But enough about the good guys, let's get some villains in here. I'll be covering the two biggest dark guilds in the fairy tale anime, Grimoire Heart and Tartaros. Let's start with Grimoire Heart and the 7 Kings of Purgatory. First up is Zancrow, who uses Fire God Slaying magic, which is kinda like Fire Dragon Slaying magic, but it kills gods, so it's supposedly stronger. But not if you ask Natsu. So anyway, for him I picked the Lawal deck, mostly because some of their boss monsters have that God of Fire feel to them, especially X-Lord and the Grader. They are mostly synchro based and rely on graveyard setup, so lucky for them they have enough ways to send cards to the graveyard. Although one of them was banned. Next up we have Kain Hikaru. He uses a cursed doll with which he can manipulate people whose hair he puts in the doll. But the true purpose of this magic is to put his own hair into the doll and then changing the doll's properties, which then reflects on himself. And that mechanically reminds me of the Element Sabers deck. It's a deck of monsters that can change their attribute in the graveyard. This may seem lackluster, but in combination with monsters that prefer a certain attribute in the graveyard, like the Elemental Lords or some strong Chaos monsters, it can put out some strong monsters with fairly minimal setup. Moving on to Caprico, or Zoldio if you wanna get technical. He uses something called Human Subordination magic, which is kinda like Lucy's Celestial Spirit magic, only he summons humans. And he used it to summon notable human warriors from the past. And one of them looked Chinese inspired, so I don't know, let's give him Ancient Warriors. I really didn't know what else to give him. Anyway, Ancient Warriors are a battle-focused archetype based on the Chinese legends of the Three Kingdoms. Next up is Rustyrose. He uses a magic called Arc of Embodiment, which allows him to materialize anything he can think of. So since he can create anything he can dream of, so to speak, I decided to go with Dream Mirrors as his deck of choice. Dream Mirrors have pair monsters that are opposites of each other, reflected in their design and light and dark attributes. And they can tag out into each other based on which one of their two field spells is on the field. It's a neat idea, but it's kinda too gimmicky to work properly. Moving on we have Azuma, who uses the Great Tree Arc magic. It's a magic that allows him to control trees as well as magic stored in the earth. He can then condense that magic to create powerful explosions to wipe out his enemies. So for him I picked a plant type deck with 3 boss monsters that can be very aggressive and go for high attack damage, and that is the Sun Avalon or Sun Seed deck. It's a fairly recent deck, so I'm not really familiar with it, but judging from what I've seen of it in the anime, it could do some pretty crazy things. Now, for Meredy, who uses the magic Magionti Sense, that can make people share senses with each other, and create magic blades that can directly attack a person's sense of pain, I was thinking DDs. No, not those are DDDs. I meant these, DDs. Most of them have the effect to banish themselves along with the opponent's monster they were battling, and have other cards that do similar things. That kinda reminded me of the whole sense sharing thing, so that's why I picked them for her. Now for the leader of the 7 Kings of Purgatory, Ultear. She uses the Time Arc magic, which allows her to manipulate the time of non-organic things and non-sapient organic things, such as plants. So for her, I picked one of Yu-Gi-Oh's few time-themed archetypes, and that is the Time Thief archetype. Personally, it's one of my favorite archetypes, so here's my own list for the deck. Their playstyle revolves around summoning rank 4 Xyz monsters, and their boss monsters can have spells and traps attached as materials as well. And they have different effects based on what type of card was detached to activate it. And they can also steal cards from your opponent's graveyard. That is always fun to do. Another big hitter for Grimoire Heart Guild is Bluenote Stinger. He uses gravity magic that is so oppressive, no one in its area of effect can move, or even stand for that matter. Well, unless you're Gildarts, and later Natsu. But for anyone else, it's too much. And the first deck that comes to mind when I think oppressive power is Domain Monarchs. It's a deck focused on tribute summoning powerful monsters and locking your opponent out of using their extra deck. And they also have access to some powerful floodgates, which makes it even harder for your opponent to get rid of their boss monsters. And finally the Master of Grimoire Heart, Hades. And this was a tough one since he uses various types of magic, from chain magic to bullet magic, even magic alteration, but his most powerful and most fearsome magic is the Demon's Eye magic. So based on that, I think a good fit for him would be the Evil Eye archetype. And it's kinda funny, I picked one of the weaker decks for the master of one of the strongest dark guilds. But the Evil Eye archetype has a decent amount of protection and has access to some powerful floodgates, so it can be tricky playing against them. And finally, moving on to Tartaros and its main members. A guild consisting entirely of demons. Well, except for one guy. So we're gonna start with him. Silver Funkbuster, who uses Ice Devil Slaying magic. And you can probably already tell by the name that he's Grey's father. So for his deck, I picked something with more connections to the Ice Barrier deck Grey would be using in this hypothetical scenario. And that is Necros. The Necros archetype is ritual focused, and it's been a fan favorite since its debut. And its more connection to the Ice Barriers is that some of the more powerful Necros monsters use the power of the 3 dragons of the Ice Barriers powers. So the Ice Teaming is there, and there's a connection with the Ice Barriers, so I think it's a good fit for Silver. Next up we have Tempester. As his name implies, his curse revolves around controlling natural disasters, so an archetype whose members look and act like the embodiments of natural disasters would be tailor-made for him. An archetype such as True Kings. Here's a list of True King cards mixed with Young Zings. They are a good mix because Young Zings come in all the attributes the True King cards care about, and they all have effects when they are destroyed. So you gain even more advantage when you use the True King's effect to special summon themselves by destroying monsters of a certain attribute from your field or hand. And of course Tempester would play True King of all calamities. He's in a dark guild, he doesn't care about the ban list. Up next we have Jackal. His curse can create explosions that are heat or fire based since Natsu can eat them, so taking that into consideration, I picked a fire attribute archetype that revolves around destroying cards, both your own and your opponent's, as his preferred deck. Of course I'm talking about Fire Kings, with some Neptis tech cards for good measure. This is kind of an interesting deck because their monsters actually prefer being destroyed, and then they come back with a vengeance the next turn and nuke your opponent's entire field. Following him we have Torafuzar. And I mean, just look at him. He looks like a shark, and he uses a water based curse. True, it's not your ordinary water, it's water poisonous for humans, but still, it's water and he's a shark, so a shark deck it is for him. And the deck basically just summons a bunch of fish monsters and then overlays them into more powerful Xyz monsters, some of which are based on sharks. So that's why it's called a shark deck. Then next we have Franmalth, and his curse is the Absorption curse, which allows him to absorb the souls of others and use their power at his own will. And that, mechanically speaking, reminded me of the Unchained deck, mostly because their link monsters have the ability to use one of your opponent's monsters and themselves to summon an even stronger link monster. So yeah, not much more to say about that. Moving on, up next is Ezel. His curse is called Tenga Goken, and his attacks are named after 5 famous Japanese swords. So keeping with the theme of famous swords, but changing the geographical location and time period, I've selected Noble Knights as his preferred deck. As I said, they're not really Japanese, but they are swords and they are famous, and there's at least 5 of them. I think there's even more. So yeah, I'm going with that. Next up we have Keys. He's a necromancer, so it's kinda fitting that he looks like a Necron from Dawn of War, and his curse obviously deals with raising the dead. So of course he would play a zombie deck. And zombies received a fair amount of support in the recent years, and good support at that. So their usual tactics of graveyard setup and revival has been really buffed lately. Up next is Seilah. She uses a curse called Makarov, which allows her to control anyone or anything, and makes them follow her orders. So I thought a deck that can take control of the opponent's monsters would be perfect for her. And to my surprise, that a deck that has a lot of effects to take control of the opponent's monsters is Aliens. Seriously, they have like at least 4 cards that take control of the opponent's monsters. I don't know what's the deal with that, but hey, at least it's balanced, requiring the opponent's monsters to have A counters on them to take control of them. And then we have the last member of the 9 Demon Gates of Tartaros, Kyôka. She has the Enhancement Curse, and she mostly uses the curse to enhance the sense of pain of others. So yeah, she's a sadist. And there's no deck that causes more pain and more suffering when you play against it than Chain Burn. And as the name implies, its focus is to reduce your opponent's life points to 0 using effect damage. And it can be viewed as a skillful deck, cause you have to pay attention to the order in which the effects resolve in order to deal maximum damage. And those of you that play Chain Burn, you know who you are. Nobody likes you. And finally we have the Master of Tartaros, Geer Tartaros. And the deck I picked for him wasn't really based on any of his abilities or curses. Rather, I based my choice on his theme of being the ultimate demon and the Master of Tartaros, the gate to the underworld. And I think, considering that, the Dark World archetype fits best to him. It's a deck of fiend type monsters that like being discarded to the graveyard, or the underworld if you like. And once they are, they can activate some powerful effects. So yeah, given the type of the monsters and the theme of the deck as a whole, I think they're a pretty good fit for Geer, if I do say so myself. And there you have it, even more fairy tale characters paired with some Yu-Gi-Oh decks. As always, this has been a very fun project, and I'm probably gonna do another one. After all, there are still so many fairy tale characters I have yet to cover, so you can look forward to it, sometime in the future. But until then, bye!